We're going to start by looking at some of the different ways in which you can engage a new member of staff. And this is important because it will determine how much control you have over them, and it will also determine how and what sort of rights they will have. So we'll look at a range of different types, starting from volunteers who have very few, if any, employment rights, up to employees who have the full range of employment rights, like the right not to be unfairly dismissed or to receive redundancy pay. And you'll see that in between is this nebulous category, this category of workers who have some employment rights, like the right to a national minimum wage, but not all employment rights. We'll also consider a completely different category, which is the self-employed contractor route. Now, once you know what kind of relationship you want to have, make sure that your contractual documents reflect that relationship. But remember that a court can look through those contracts at the reality of the relationship and decide that someone actually is an employee or a worker, even though your documents only call them, say, a volunteer. So let's start by looking at employees. Why would you want employees? Well, they give you the closest relationship with your member of staff. So you have a lot of control over how they work, when they work, and what they do. But in return, they get the full range of employment rights. So it's a more costly relationship. But it might be the best way to retain key talent. The kind of rights we're talking about here are things like the right not to be unfairly dismissed, the right to redundancy pay, and then those rights that workers have as well, like the right to a national minimum wage and maximum working hours. When you have employees, you can engage them in different ways. So you could take them on as full-time employees or part-time employees. You could have flexible contracts. And this is very popular because it's important for your equal opportunities. It makes it easier to hire more diverse staff. And it also gives you the flexibility to have the right workforce at the right time. Now, as that contract becomes more and more flexible, you might find that you're not dealing with this employee category anymore, but it's so flexible that you actually have a worker contract. So, for example, something that's in the news a lot at the moment is the idea of the 0 hours contract. A 0 hours contract means that you have no obligation to give the individual work, and they in return have no obligation but an expectation to accept that work. It gives you and the worker a lot of flexibility. And because of that flexibility, they have fewer rights. Now, there's more information about these statuses on the gov.uk website. That will give you information about employment statuses. The other website you want to think about is HMRC, because the status that the individual has will affect their tax treatment as well. Employees and workers should be taxed at source. You should deduct tax and national insurance contributions through your PAYE systems, your pay-as-you-earn systems. You should also make sure that employees and workers get the national minimum wage. And again, this changes from time to time. The gov.uk website sets out what it is at any given time. Moving on, let's think about whether you might want a volunteer. As I said before, a volunteer has almost no employment rights, but you've got to get the relationship right, because otherwise a court will look through that relationship and decide that the individual actually has the right, for example, not to be discriminated against or to get the national minimum wage. What creates a volunteer relationship? Well, start by having a very flexible arrangement. Do not put in place a real contract. Don't have obligations, but set expectations. So, for example, set expectations about what the individual's role might be, when and where they might show up, but they are not obliged to be there at those times. Bearing in mind that it's a bit easier for charities to show that you have a genuine volunteer relationship. So there's actually a special category in the legislation for charities to have what's called voluntary workers, which is basically another name for a volunteer. And the legislation acknowledges that there's a special need for charities to engage individuals on a more flexible basis without paying the national minimum wage. To remain within that category, make sure, again, that the relationship is flexible. Make sure that you're not giving anything in exchange for the work that they're doing. So you can give them some basic training to be able to carry out their work, but they shouldn't be skilled up as a result of this work necessarily. And of course, if they're getting pay, they're no longer volunteers. What you can give is reimbursement of expenses. And in some cases, you can have subsistence agreements if you're working through another charity, for example, but they're a bit complicated. The gov.uk website sets how you stay within those guidelines. Something very similar to a volunteer arrangement might be an internship or an apprenticeship. So interns often will come to you as part of a registered course, higher learning institution in the UK. If that's for less than 1 year, then and part of their course, then they also come to you as a sort of voluntary type worker, so they're not entitled to the national minimum wage. I also mentioned apprenticeships. Apprenticeships are formal structures to train on the job. They're set out by legislation. They're perhaps not as relevant for charities, but again, you can go and check the gov.uk website and see whether there's a category that suits you. I also said we'd look at this completely different category, not employee, not worker, not volunteer, namely the self-employed contractor. Self-employed contractor is an arm's length business relationship between you, the charity, and either another company or an individual. And that individual will have quite a lot of flexibility. So you won't have a lot of control over how they carry out the services. They might even be able to appoint a substitute if they're not available on any given day. And another hallmark of a self-employed contractor is that they might work for several clients at any one time. They have no obligation to work for you, to accept work from you, other than what's specifically set out in the contract. Why is this so important? Well, if somebody is a self-employed contractor, then national minimum wage does not apply, but also the tax situation is very different. You would not deduct tax and national insurance at source. The individual would be responsible for their own taxes, so you would simply pay them gross. So once again, the type of status that somebody holds affects their legal rights, and it affects the tax treatment, and that's why it's important to make sure that you think about what you need and what you want to pay for it.